Hello. In this lecture we will talk about utility, especially what we call as cardinal utility. Now I have discussed the idea of utility briefly in other lectures also, previous lectures. I am numbering those lectures so you can, if you are watching, you can watch in that order. So cardinal utility essentially means something which has to do with numbers, something like 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, 2.2, 3.7, any numbers, as long as they can be measured. Okay, that's what cardinal means, something that can be measured. Now, cardinal utility in microeconomic analysis isn't used as much as the indifference curves approach, which generally says that among all the points of this curve, okay, the utility, the total utility derived by the consumer is going to be exactly the same. To reach a higher utility point, it will have to increase the consumption of both the goods in some combination. However, today we will not talk about the indifference curves approach. Something which is much more intuitive is cardinal approach, because everyone understands that when we consume something, whenever we consume something, we derive what we call as satisfaction. Now these are uncountable, unquantifiable terms. If you have a pizza, you may derive some sort of satisfaction from it, but the level of satisfaction that you derive and the level of satisfaction that I derive will be different, and it cannot be quantified in numbers. But one thing is for sure, the fact that you're consuming something itself says that you want it and you wish to derive some sort of either pleasure or satisfaction from it, right? In other words, utility. To bring this into analysis, we have to quantify it, not to accurately record, because it's impossible, not to accurately record the actual number or assign an actual number to a utility, but to make it so in order to be used in analysis and to further understand something else. That's the whole purpose behind assigning some kind of number to the utility. And this idea is much more intuitive when we start talking about it. I had to pause the video for a minute. There was too much background noise. Well, there we go again. So here, to get a good idea, it's much more intuitive to talk about cardinal utility. And as we get on with our explanation, you'll understand why it's a good idea. At least that's what I think. So one thing is for sure, we all know that we derive some kind of satisfaction from consuming a good or a service. Now what utility analysis says is that as we go on consuming more and more of the same commodity, be it good or a service, within a limited period of time. So if you're consuming units of chocolate, obviously you can't say that I consume 1 unit of chocolate per day, so my utility doesn't really decline. You have to use a little bit of common sense here, obviously, that utility will decline if it is used, if it is consumed within a certain period of time. That means it applies on subsequent units of consumption. within a limited period of time. This is just to make sure, of course you understand that, this is just to make sure that there is no confusion. So the cardinal idea of utility was first proposed by Hermann Heinrich Gaussen. I have a slide pertaining to it, but it doesn't matter. So later on, Jeremy Bentham and also the English philosopher John Stuart Mill used this idea of utility, and especially in his book Utilitarianism. Which is a school of thought in Western philosophy. He used the same idea of utility. So as we keep on consuming more and more, now let's look at what it really is. And the explanation is actually quite simple. It's not the explanation that I'm worried about that you won't get, but the implications, okay, the consequences of this idea are quite wonderful, I would say, because it helps us explain, helps us understand a lot of other phenomena in economics. So try to understand it well and also think about it. Have your own perspective about it, because we'll be using this idea in our lecture series down the line. And of course I'll be explaining it slightly even then whenever I'm using that idea, or I'll refer you to this lecture. But it's one thing is for sure, it's much more intuitive, and it's directly applicable on a lot of things. Okay, so when we think of money, we can actually convert the idea of money into the idea of utility, and the idea of profit, the idea of motives, lot of things, consumer surplus, so on and so forth. There are a lot of ideas that will be discussed down the line that can be correlated with utility, even elasticity for that matter. Because when we look at elasticity, actually, I'm not explaining what it is, I'll explain it in a separate lecture, don't worry about it. But even for a linear curve, we know, we talked about slope in the last lecture. Okay, slope of the line, that means essentially the rate of change. So whenever we change, any change observed in the vertical axis, we generally take it as y-axis. What is the change reflected in x-axis, or any change observed in x-axis, what is the change reflected in y-axis? So that is what we call as rate of change, how things change depending on the change in another variable. But elasticity, on the other hand, actually so the slope of the line is constant. Slope of the line, which is something like this, is constant. But that is not really the case with elasticity. Elasticity indeed is not constant. Sorry. Elasticity is not constant. Why is that the case? Well, it is the case, it has something to do with the utility, especially diminishing marginal utility. We'll speak about it when we talk about elasticity in greater detail. So let's get on with it. That one thing is for sure, that as you keep on consuming more of something within a considerable period of time, the satisfaction that you derive from it declines. Or another word for it is, the satisfaction diminishes. So let's take this example. Here we have, let's say, chocolate consumption and utils. Now what this utils, this is nothing but an artificially constructed, an artificial construct, you can say. It's not, I mean, it's not a real thing, but we have invented it. Okay, Gaussian invented it, because otherwise what are you going to call a number which is assigned to the level of satisfaction? You're going to call something, right? Weight is generally represented as either, in ounces or kgs or grams, so on and so forth. Length, right, is in centimeters, kilometers, inches, so on and so forth. So you'll see every measure will have some kind of word associated with it. Gaussian just thought of a word called utils. You can call it anything else, but this makes sense to call it utils. Yeah, because utility. Okay, so now first unit of chocolate, let's assume, gives you 20 utils. Okay. And this explanation, I mean, by looking at the table, it's quite obvious. You probably must have figured it out, but I'll give the explanation anyway. For, let's say, first unit of chocolate, and remember, this is a hypothetical example because it has more to do with analysis rather than the real life. Economics is all about analysis of the models, of the paradigm that we make, of the models that we make, so that we can understand something about human economic behavior. So by consuming 1 unit of chocolate, it is assumed, I'll highlight this again and again, it is assumed that you get 20 utils. Let's assign it 20 utils. Now what is marginal? Marginal is nothing. Anything marginal is just the rate of change. Or for the time being, you can simply call it change. Anything marginal is nothing but change. Okay. So when we say marginal utility, we mean the change in utility, and it will be represented by utils. Okay. So first one, it's assumed you get 20. You could have written 30 over here, doesn't matter. It's how example is constructed, that's what matters. So you get 20. The change in utility, of course, when you consumed nothing, as far as the chocolate is concerned, you didn't derive anything from the chocolate. So the total utility was also 0, and the change in utility was also 0. Yeah. So when you consume the first unit of chocolate, you got some kind of satisfaction from it, and the change in your utility from that piece of chocolate was also 20. Now when you consume the second bit of chocolate, the total utility will increase because of course you wanted chocolate, that's it, that's what is assumed, and your utility increases, but not exactly in the same proportion. That is what the idea is. Not exactly in the same proportion, because you already have consumed one. That's the idea behind the declining or diminishing marginal utility. That as you keep on consuming, as you keep on having more and more of something, the value for that good or service, the value for that commodity declines in your opinion or in your mind, because it's all about, we're discussing, I mean, a little bit of from a psychological perspective, that if you have a bunch of stuff, the value that you'll assign to each unit of that stuff will not be as much if you have very little of something. If you have only 10 rupees in your pocket, right, or $10, depending on the country you're living, if you have something, $10 in your pocket, maybe, and the price of, a pint of beer is $6, let's say, then you'll be, you'll probably have only one beer, and you'll think, okay, should I even spend my money on beer, maybe I can buy like a nice dinner for $9 and sleep happily. You know, I'm not saying that you only had $9, $10 to begin with and to end with. All I'm saying is that the value for that $10 will be higher for you as compared to if you had something like $5,000 in your pocket. Now, as I have already said that money acts a bit differently, because with money you can buy multiple goods and services. So I'm not saying that somebody who has $10 and somebody who has $5,000, the value for $10 for someone who has 5,000, so let's say X has 5,000 and Z has 10. I'm not saying that X will not really have any value for $10, because the money is slightly different. But let's take that example, that if you have, let's say, 15 shirts, you can always lend that, one or two shirts to your buddies. But if you have only 2 shirts and you have to go to your workplace, you can't really afford to lend anything. So the value that you'll assign to these 2 shirts will be higher in your mind as compared to if you had 15 shirts. That's all there is to it. So as it's the same idea, as you keep on having more and more of something, the satisfaction or the value that you assign to it actually declines. Okay, so the value that you assign declines. So in essence, we can also say the same thing about consumption. If you consume more and more, the satisfaction that you derive from it declines. That's all that is being said here. So as you go to third consumption, third bit of your chocolate, the utility still increases a little bit, but not again in the same proportion. So now the marginal utility, that means the change in utility, delta generally is the representative of change. This little symbol over here, this little triangle, it's called as delta. So delta U is 10, the change in utility, or marginal utility is only 10 now. On to fourth, it declines slightly, marginal utility is only 5. When you consume your fifth bit, the example presumes that your utility remains constant. Your utility doesn't change. That means you don't really want this fifth. You can have it or you can not have it. You're fine with both. It's like when you're eating, and you all had that feeling, right? Especially when we consume food or some kind of food item, that okay, we might want to have another piece of bread, okay, or we may skip it. It won't really make a difference. So that's the idea that is kind of explored here, that another bit of chocolate may give you some utility, or you may have another bit of chocolate, it may or may not really give you any utility. So we consider it to be constant, because you're indifferent, you're neutral, okay, you're neutral or indifferent. So all we are saying is that there was no change observed in the total utility. In this case, the marginal utility becomes 0. That means now you are at a point where you don't really need to consume any more chocolate, or you do not wish to consume any more chocolate, because the satisfaction that you are getting from it has stopped. That means if you consume any more of it, it actually may harm you, or it may give you dissatisfaction, displeasure. It may make you uneasy, and that is what is called as disutility or negative utility. Simple. So that means after a certain point of time, things may actually start falling in value, is what, in other words, you can say that things will actually start falling in value. Yeah. So if there is too much of something, things will actually start falling in value. So we call it as in terms of consumption, the utility that you derive is negative. And if you keep on consuming, it's further negative. Okay. So this utility increases or the utility diminishes. So this point, the arbitrarily chosen point, can be called as the point of satiety or the point of satiation. It's just a fancy word for what you call as saturation. Okay, or totally full. Correct. So it's whichever way you want to look at it, this is where you should stop. All right. So if you want, you can just take a look at this slide. It's all the things that we have already talked about. Marginal utility becomes zero, called as point of satiety or satiation point. Marginal utility is negative after that. This negative utility can be called as disutility. Just a term. Now let's take a look at the assumptions. Okay. It's better to look at the example first and then look at the assumptions. It's a cardinal concept, we already discussed that. Utility of money is constant, that's the assumption of the model. Okay, and this is something that we're going to challenge. Rational consumer, okay, it's considered that a person wants something, that's why he is trying to consume something. Okay, that he's deriving some kind of satisfaction from it, that is why. However, sometimes there are exceptions, like if substance addiction, substance abuse, that's one big problem, that people sometimes don't really derive substance abuse or addiction. People don't really derive actual satisfaction from it, but it's just that their brain is telling them that they want it somehow. Full knowledge of availability and quantities, and now this is also a problematic assumption, but again, for a model to be held true, we have to take certain assumptions. Not that we should not challenge them, of course we should challenge them, we should in fact, it's the assumptions which will tell us the limitations of the model, right? And there are no substitutes, that's also not correct. There are very few things for which there are no substitutes. Knowledge of exact prices, I mean, this is also problematic. Availability of and quantities, the knowledge of availability, that's also problematic, because most people, they don't have the correct information, that's why they make bad decisions, or they make let's say financially not so wise decisions. And the last one is choices are certain. That's also not true, because choices can be manipulated. People can be manipulated to make different choices. Okay, the entire industry called advertising industry, the advertisements that you see on television, the entire industry is based on violating this assumption. So yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily true, but if again model says, since we have constructed this model says that if you flout any of these assumptions, the utility analysis presented as such will not hold true. Limitation, exact criticism of the things, and even actually we criticize it a bit more than what the limitations suggest. The sizable, suitable size units, of course, I mean, that's not really a limitation, but it's common sense that otherwise it won't make any sense. So the spoon of water or carton full of sweets cannot be considered as one single unit. It makes sense, obviously. Rational consumer and ordinary goods, here again they are pointing to the fact that the goods cannot be, by ordinary goods we mean normal goods, non-addictive goods. Okay, so no big deal, we already talked about it. Now another thing is that what about something that we discussed in the beginning? What about the marginal utility of money? So marginal utility of money, it says that it will decrease but never up till zero. However, I've written it, but of course at the same time I'm also questioning it, that maybe it will not decrease. But one thing is for certain, that it will not never go to zero. The reason it will never go to zero is because you can always buy other goods and services with money. So it does not matter how much money you have, the value for money, and this is very true even at a, if you look at the practical world, people with a lot of money, it's not that they don't value money after having all that money. In fact, they are constantly working towards earning more and more money. So there is no upper limit or a ceiling to how much money is enough. Why? The rational reason for it, okay, people may say that, okay, they are crazy or they're irrational or they're inhuman or they're, so all that aside, not getting into that, all that aside, if you think about from an analytical perspective, okay, you can say that, well, money is actually representing what? All the goods and services in the world. That means, and all the goods and services means you can buy anything with that. It's freely exchangeable with any good or service you might want to consume. So yeah, utility is, it will fall if you keep on consuming one thing and one thing only, but it won't really fall, it won't really matter. So if you have chocolate, consuming chocolate and pizza and all different goodies, okay, and then you go on for shopping, you buy something, you buy, diamond, gold, yacht, of jet plane, who cares, like depends on how much money you have. So actually speaking, the marginal utility of money, that means every time you're gonna earn an extra amount of money, the utility is not going to decline, it will keep on increasing. Now there may come a point where you will not work as hard as you would as you did before for an extra unit of money. Maybe you'll work as hard as you did before for a bit more money, okay, for a bigger unit of money, which sort of flouts our assumption about that if you keep on consuming more and more of something, the utility of it will decline. That's not really the case, simply owing to the reason is that money is actually a representative commodity. It's not really a commodity, it's a representative commodity, okay, and that is why its utility will not really decline. And even if it does decline, it will definitely will not achieve a point zero. Now what about the people who leave the entire world behind? I don't know, maybe they find utility in something else. But as long as, again, as long as you want money, the utility for money will not decline. If you say I don't want money at all, it's like saying I don't want to consume chocolate at all. Well, then that means you derive no pleasure, no satisfaction whatsoever from chocolate. So it's the same thing as saying I don't want any money, so that means you derive no satisfaction from money at all. So there you go, problem solved. Okay, so it's only applicable on those goods and services or on those commodities or on those things that you actually want. So if you want money and it's a representative commodity, its utility will not really decline because you can buy a variety of goods and services with it. Okay. Now on to another concept, letting go of money, giving up money. Giving up money can actually create disutility, correct? So money being the representative of all the commodities, letting go of any commodity will also cause you a bit of pain, right? If you, let's say, if you want to trade something for something else, the fact that you have to give something in order to get something, the giving part of the transaction is not as pleasurable, or rather not pleasurable at all, as compared to the getting part. So that is why people complain about things being expensive. So that means what? That they have to give up money and more money than before, so that causes them discomfort. So giving up money will definitely create disutility, and definitely if you had to give up more and more and more and more and more money for the same amount of goods and services, which something that we call as inflation, general rise general rise in prices of goods and services. I mean, that's what inflation is. And so that means for the same unit of something, good or any commodity, you have to give up more and more money, and if becomes hyperinflation, then that becomes a real phenomenal problem. Okay, and we have discussed inflation in previous lectures. So definitely giving up money can create disutility. So then why do people give up money? After all, giving up money is going to create disutility. But if you give up money for something, so if you want to buy a can of tuna or anything, yeah, a cup of coffee, you want to get some kind of satisfaction from consuming coffee. How much dissatisfaction will you bear? This is where the idea of utils, yeah, utils come to our rescue, basically. So we can use this concept, even though artificial, we can use this concept to solve this problem. So you're giving up money. How much would you give up to get coffee? Yeah. So we can think of it like this. So let's assume coffee gives us 10 utils. The cost of coffee, the price of coffee is $2. All the things that we can buy with $2 is either, remember this, either less than 10 utils or equal to 10 utils. Alright, let me get a plain sheet of paper to explain this. So we were saying that if you, let's say, are spending money to get coffee, let's assume that coffee gets you 10 utils. Alright, coffee gets you 10 utils, and coffee, the price of coffee, it costs $2. With $2, all the goods and services that you can buy will either give you 10 utils or less than 10 utils. Alright, so either less than or equal to 10 utils. So that means what? The $2 is worth either 10 utils or less than 10 utils, because that's what we are saying. Anything that $2 can buy is either less than 10 utils or equal to 10 utils. Well, only then I'll buy coffee. Here I'm assuming that I'm not addicted to coffee, obviously, because that doesn't really count. So in this case, what is happening is the utility of money is either less than or equal to the commodity, utility of commodity. The utility of money is either less than or equal to the utility that is derived by coffee, or the utility derived by coffee or the commodity in question is either greater than or equal to the utility that you derive from that much money that you have to spend. So in this case, $2, right? Otherwise, if that wasn't the case, you won't really make this transaction, right? Does that make sense? And this little idea will be very useful for us when we speak about demand analysis and supply and production and elasticity, all these things. Remember what we said, that if the utility of money was more, if those $2 gave us greater than 10 utils, okay, the value of $2 was more than 10 utils, and coffee gives us 10 utils, then we wouldn't make that transaction. That means we wouldn't exchange $2 for a cup of coffee. That transaction will never take place, theoretically speaking, of course. So that's the idea behind utility and cardinal utility analysis, and it's very useful in intuiting about a lot of things, a lot of models, a lot of ideas in economics. Now let's look at a couple of questions. Okay, something like, will a rich person have the same marginal utility as the poor person for 1 unit of money? And we have already talked about this, that maybe, maybe not, who knows. But if you have less money, the value for that money will be higher. Now this is one of those questions for which we don't really have an answer, alright, because you might as well meet a millionaire or a billionaire, or I don't know, if there is, you know, a trillionaire, and ask him for $10, maybe he'll just, you know, shoo you off, because you say, I don't want to give you anything, even if you're saying, well, I need money more than you do. That's sort of a silly proposition to make to anyone, but I'm just saying that we don't really know the answer to this question. Now another question is relative scarcity and diamond water paradox. So I mean, relative scarcity essentially means that you know, actually speaking, diamond doesn't really you know, do anything for you, frankly speaking. It's just for display purposes, right? It's mostly for display, to convey some kind of status in society. That has its value. Obviously it's not, I mean, it's not popular because it has no value whatsoever, or it's some kind of conspiracy by De Beers. Maybe the price being some, constant, maybe, that has something to do with restricting the supply, but people do like to have diamonds, yeah, and that's why it has such immense value. On the other hand, water is absolutely essential for life. I mean, it in comparison to diamond, water has infinitely more value, but water is almost free. Not these days anyway, but we can say water is almost free compared to diamond. Yeah. So if diamonds are relatively scarce, do you think that that makes diamonds more expensive? So the idea of relative scarcity is that, oh well, you can, one way of looking at it is because water is so abundant that the value, it has no value whatsoever, and the diamonds are very rare, so they have immense value. But then again, even in your mind, psychologically speaking, diamond must have some kind of value, otherwise, so even if diamonds are dime a dozen, would they stop having that kind of value? It's quite possible. Again, one of these questions which we don't have a definitive answer, but if you are in a place that, let's say you're stuck, and this is a really, weird example, but let's say you're stuck in a desert, somewhere in the middle of the desert, and you have a bag full of diamonds, would you trade your diamonds for a water bottle? I mean, it will clearly be an extortion, but I think you will, because water will help you keep alive, and then you can probably earn more diamonds or get more diamonds wherever the hell you got those diamonds from in the first place. But to keep your life, you will definitely trade your diamond, and that's what is water diamond paradox. That why that is the case, that diamonds are exorbitantly expensive and water is not. Another little thing about utility which has to do with the theory of utility, and it's not very important, but just in passing I want you to know that, because I don't know, there might be, if you're enrolled in a course or something, there might be a question on it. So Marshall's definition of the law of substitution, that people will distribute their money, a thing that he can put to several uses, essentially money, which can be put to several uses, or you can buy different goods and services with this particular commodity, yeah, thing to several uses, which essentially means nothing but money. He'll distribute it, means he'll distribute that money in such a way that it has the same marginal utility in all. Now this is just a theory, and that is why I'm not putting too much weight to it, okay, but just so you know that there is something like this. So proportionality rule, basically, that's Gauss's second law. Now just something like, for the sake of convenience, to, let's say, two commodities, you can put money in these two commodities, goods or services. So you can call it anything, apples and oranges, just as fun. And marginal utility for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units. So apple has like 1 unit. Let me write it over here. So marginal utility for 1 unit, 2nd unit, 3rd unit, 4th unit, 5th unit. Okay. So the marginal utility is such that for 1st unit apples get 100, 80, so on and so forth. So marginal utility of apples divided by price of apples is equal to marginal utility of oranges divided by price of oranges. So marginal utility of apples 40 and the price of apples is 4, and marginal utility of oranges 20, and I've already solved it, so I'm just showing you, divided by price of oranges 2. Okay, because 4, 10, 10, so both the utilities are equal. Okay, so the money will be distributed in such a way where the proportion or the ratio of prices to their utilities, or the ratio of utilities to their prices, are exactly the same in case of all the commodities. That's the idea, and that idea is actually extended further, because when we in later stages in intermediate classes, when we take a look at calculus and mathematical economics, we'll see this idea being repeated again. So marginal utility is nothing but the change in utility, so we can call it as U also. So marginal utility of apples, whatever it may be, okay, the money will be divided in such a way where the marginal utility of apples divided by its price, marginal utility of oranges divided by its price will be equal. Okay, so that's the last idea we're going to explore in this lecture. And finally in the next lecture we'll talk about why demand curve slopes downwards and supply curve upwards. And we already know that, because if we make a demand curve something like this, it slopes downwards, so if the price declines and the quantity demanded increases. So coming back to the same example, if with $2 all the goods and services that you can buy is either less than 10 utils or equal to 10 utils, and coffee gives you, let's say, 10 utils. But now if the price of coffee declines to $1, you still derive 10 utils from coffee, but now if the price declines, you get 10 utils with $1 now. So that means one of the possibilities will be, with $2 you can actually get somewhere around 20 utils. And I said somewhere around or approximately because it's a hypothetical example, and we have already talked about diminishing marginal utility. So if you consume more of it, you may derive a little less than what you derived previously. That's why. So demand curve slopes downwards and supply curve upwards. The reason that is the case, so let's talk about demand curve. If the price increases, less of the commodity is bought, and if the price decreases, more of the commodity is bought. Similarly, more suppliers are willing to supply at a particular price if the price increases from P2 to P1. Yeah. Why? Because the total utility that they derive from it, okay, that increases, they get more money. So we can use, and this is I'm talking very superficially right now, because we're not really looking at demand curve and supply curve in detail. When we talk about it in detail, we'll invoke that concept. Okay, so that's it for now. Thank you.